They told her to bring her violin as a joke. They didn't think she'd actually play. But when she did, the whole gym went silent. Who is Amara Brooks? Why did her music make even the teachers stop breathing? This isn't just a performance, it's a response. Watch until the end to see how one girl changed everything without saying a word. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more powerful stories. Roosevelt Community Charter School, Atlanta, Georgia. Late afternoon. Fifth period. Dust and silence. The sunlight slanted in through the high windows, casting slow-moving beams across the tile floor. The kind of light that made everything look older, more tired. Even the dust floating in the air seemed heavy, like it had nowhere better to be. The classroom buzzed in the quiet way classrooms always do at the end of the day, paper shuffling, pen caps clicking, shoes tapping underneath two small desks. In the back row, last seat by the window, sat Amara Brooks. Same spot every day, same silence. An old, scratched violin case rested vertically between her knees, held like it might break if she loosened her grip. Her hood was up. Her shoulders were drawn in like she'd folded herself smaller on purpose. She didn't speak unless directly asked, and even then it was one-word replies. Teachers often forgot she was even there until moments like this. "All right, folks," said Coach Ryan Ellis, stepping into the room like he didn't quite belong. He was the PE teacher, still wearing his windbreaker and basketball whistle. "We've got the talent showcase coming up next Friday. Singers, dancers, magicians, whatever you got. Sign up sheet S in the office." His voice had that tone, half joke, half obligation. Like he didn't believe anything impressive would come of it, but it was on the schedule, so here he was, saying the words. That's when Mrs. Kendall Tate, the math teacher, leaned across her desk, her voice sweet and sharp like a hidden blade. "What about our little violinist back there?" she said, nodding toward the back. "She's been lugging that case around all year. Might as well show us what's inside." A few students snorted. Then Coach Ellis, grinning without really thinking, added, "Yeah, Brooks, let's see what that thing can really do." And that's all it took. Someone in the front let out a fake violin screech. Another whispered, "Mozart's Ghost," followed by giggles. The laughter spread like a slow leak, soft at first, then louder, messier, until it filled the room. It wasn't cruel in the obvious way. That's what made it worse. It pretended to be harmless. It wore a friendly face. Amara didn't flinch, didn't look up. But her fingers curled tighter around the violin case's worn handle. Her knuckles paled. She could feel it, every eye on her, waiting for her to shrink to confirm what they already believed, that she didn't belong here, that she wouldn't say anything, but then she did. "I'll perform," she said, flat, calm, no drama, like she was ordering lunch. The room stopped. Breath caught mid-laugh. A desk creaked as someone shifted in their seat. Even Coach Ellis blinked. She still didn't look up, just reached for her notebook and quietly turned to a blank page as if nothing had happened. But something had, and everyone felt it. Amara didn't look up when the final bell rang. She never did. While the rest of the 8th grade stampede shoved toward freedom, she waited, slowly zipping her backpack, wrapping the violin case strap around her wrist twice, then once more for good measure. She didn't like rushing. Rushing made noise. Rushing made people look. Outside, the sun was still warm, but the wind had a bite to it, sharp and fast as passing cars. Amara turned left out of the school gate and walked the long way home, always the long way. Through the back lots, past the basketball court no one really used, and under the peeling mural near Edgewood Park. The mural used to be bright, portraits of local leaders, poets, musicians. Now it was faded and chipped, like the neighborhood had stopped believing in color. She liked it that way. No one hung around there. No one asked questions. By the time she reached Arlington Arms, the old brick apartment complex with the tilted mailbox and crooked stairwell, the street was already emptying. Her building smelled like dust and bleach. The carpet in the hallway was always damp. Second floor, apartment 203. Inside it was quiet mostly. Her mom, Latasha, was in the kitchen tying a scarf around her curls, prepping for her night shift cleaning office buildings downtown. Her little brother, Zion, 6 years old and obsessed with dinosaurs, was watching cartoons with the sound off. "Hey, baby," her mom called without turning. "You eat yet?" "Not hungry," Amara said. Ma'am, don't let me catch you passing out with that violin in your lap again. Amara half smiled, slid past the living room and ducked into the laundry nook, the smallest room in the apartment and the only place she could play without waking the neighbors. The walls were lined with old towels for soundproofing. The light flickered when she turned it on. She sat on a milk crate, opened her case and cradled the instrument like something alive. Amara didn't go to parties. She didn't stay after school. She didn't argue when teachers got her name wrong or when kids snickered as she walked past. She wasn't trying to be different. The violin was just the only place where she could finally be herself. The first time Amara touched a violin, it wasn't hers. It was her grandfather's, old, beat up, with a deep scratch along the side and a tuning peg that never held tight. He kept it wrapped in a towel under his bed, like a secret. He played at the local church every third Sunday, low, bending blues that made the elders close their eyes and hum along. Sometimes, when the world outside felt especially mean, he played right there in the living room barefoot, his fingers dancing like they remembered something he hadn't said out loud in years. Amara was 7 when he placed the instrument in her lap. "It ain't pretty," he told her, "but it speaks better than most folks." She asked him if she was allowed to learn. He looked at her for a long time and said, "When the world won't let you talk, baby girl, let this talk for you." He died 2 years later. Heart gave out before the city did. The violin became hers. The scratch stayed, so did the silence. They couldn't afford lessons. No online tutorials, no new strings, just her, the old music books he'd scribbled in, and a mother who worked so many hours her voice started sounding like voicemail messages, brief, tired, necessary. Latasha never pushed her to practice, but she never stopped her either, even when the neighbors banged on the walls, even when Zion couldn't sleep from the creaking notes. Amara turned the laundry room into a world of her own. She'd sit on that crate and play until her fingers ached, until the bridge leaned, until the strings buzzed from overuse. Sometimes she'd wrap band-aids around her fingertips just to keep going, not for applause, not for teachers, for herself. Because in the music she could stretch out, speak without fear of being misunderstood. Every note was a sentence no one could interrupt. Every bow stroke, a paragraph of things she didn't know how to say aloud. She wasn't preparing for a stage. She was trying to survive a world that talked over her. And music listened back. By Wednesday, the buzz had spread like spilled soda in the hallway, sticky and impossible to ignore. Someone had written Amara Brooks in neat, slanted handwriting on the talent show sign-up sheet taped beside the front office window. Her name sat at number 12, just under a group of breakdancers and above a kid planning to rap over a YouTube beat. At first, people thought it was a prank. Then came the bets. 5 says she backs out by Thursday, a boy muttered near the vending machine. Nah, she's gonna freeze, like mid-note mid-squeak gone. She'll probably play Twinkle Twinkle and cry, someone else added, laughing too loud. Amara walked past all of it. Same slow pace, same blank face, but every word landed. She folded each one up quietly like paper darts and tucked them deep in her chest. At lunch, Coach Ellis stood by the court fence, arms crossed, sunglasses on like he was guarding something important. When he spotted her tuning her violin by the bleachers, he smirked. "You nervous yet, Brooks?" he called out. She didn't even look up. Just turned one peg a fraction tighter, checked the resonance, and kept playing under her breath. Ellis laughed like he hadn't expected an answer anyway. The only person who approached without teasing was Jalen Davis, a soft-spoken boy who stayed late after school to play piano in the band room. He leaned against the wall beside her during break and said quietly, "Original or cover?" Amara blinked, then said, "Original." He smiled like that was the right answer. "Good," he said. "Do something they can't compare to anything else." That night her mom stood in the doorway as Amara tightened her strings, her posture tense, her mouth a flat line. "You trying to prove something, baby?" Latasha asked, arms folded across her work uniform. Amara didn't stop adjusting the bow. "Not to them." Her voice was low, steady. "To me." Her mom didn't argue, just nodded and left the door cracked open. The night before the showcase, during one of her final run-throughs, her E-string snapped, the note jolting like a shout in the dark. She didn't pause, reached into the case, pulled out a frayed backup string, restrung it with hands that shook slightly, and kept playing. Friday morning came quiet. No breakfast. No music. Amara's hands trembled as she pulled her hoodie over her head. Her violin case hung at her side like armor. Her eyes, though, those didn't shake. They burned. The gym was packed. Fold-out chairs scraped against the floor as students fidgeted and whispered. Teachers leaned along the walls, arms crossed. Phones were already raised, screens glowing like tiny flashlights in a storm. Some acts had already come and gone, singers with shaky voices, dancers who missed their marks, a kid who tried stand up and got more groans than laughs. Polite clapping followed each one. No one remembered the names. They were all just background noise before the next moment to film. Then came number 12. A murmur rippled through the crowd as the MC stumbled over the name. Next up, Amara Brooks. Some kids laughed quietly, nudging each other, but Amara didn't hear them. She stepped out from behind the curtain like she had nowhere else to go. Her violin in one hand, bow in the other, hoodie zipped, head high. The light above her buzzed, flickering faintly like it was unsure if it should stay on. There was no microphone, no music stand, no speech. She didn't need one. She lifted her violin to her shoulder and played. The first note was barely there, thin as breath under a locked door, but it held. It wavered and then stretched. Her fingers moved with certainty, her bow slicing the silence like a whisper demanding to be heard. The piece was called Speak When They Won't. She'd written it herself. It started soft like hiding. Then it bent. Then it surged. Then it begged. Notes wrapped around each other, rising, falling, catching in the air like hands reaching out. Somewhere halfway through, someone lowered their phone. Another leaned forward. Even the teachers, even Ellis and Tate, stopped moving. And when the final note came, Amara didn't rush it. She let it linger, let it ache. A thread of sound pulling tight, then clapping. One pair of hands, then two. Then a wave, loud, real. She didn't bow, she didn't smile. She just stood there, violin resting against her chest like a heartbeat. For the first time, they weren't laughing. They were listening. Backstage, the noise of the crowd still echoed, clapping, murmurs, the shuffling of chairs. But inside the hallway behind the curtain, it was quiet. Amara leaned against the cinder-block wall, violin resting across her knees. Her hands had finally stopped shaking, not from relief, from something deeper. Like her body had exhaled the breath it had been holding for months. Coach Ellis passed by first. He didn't say anything. Just gave a quick nod, like he'd only just realized she existed outside of a roster sheet. He opened his mouth like he might try for words, but nothing came out. Just a small, awkward pat on her shoulder before he walked on. Mrs. Tate was next. She stood in front of Amara for a second, her arms crossed tight across her chest like she was holding something in. "I owe you an apology," she said, voice low. Amara didn't look away. "You should have seen me before Friday," she replied, calm as ever. Mrs. Tate blinked, lips parted just slightly. No sarcasm, no sharpness, just quiet, the kind that made people think. She walked off without a word. Then came Ms. Delgado, the art teacher, the only adult who ever really looked at Amara like she was whole even before the performance. She slipped a folded piece of paper into Amara's hand without speaking, just a warm touch on the wrist and a knowing smile. Amara waited until she was alone before opening it. "You didn't just play, you spoke." That was all it said. At home, the apartment was dim and still. The only light came from the stove's clock blinking 7:12. Her violin case was heavier than usual in her hand, like it was holding something new. Latasha stood by the front door, still in her cleaning uniform, the scent of bleach and lavender clinging to her sleeves. She didn't ask the usual questions. No, did you mess up? No, how many clapped? Just one. Did they listen? Amara nodded. Yeah, that was enough. Latasha opened her arms and Amara stepped into them like muscle memory. They stood there in the glow of the stovetop light, not saying anything else. There wasn't a trophy. There wasn't a stage photo, but there was a moment. And for once, silence didn't mean small. It meant seen. Monday morning, Roosevelt Community Charter School didn't feel the same. The halls were just as loud. Lockers slammed, sneakers squeaked, someone's phone buzzed with a too loud ringtone. But when Amara Brooks walked in, the air around her seemed to bend just slightly, like the noise took one cautious step back. No one cheered, no one clapped, but they moved. Some students parted without realizing it, their bodies shifting like a tide around her. A few whispered quietly, not cruelly, "That's her." Not the girl with the weird violin, not Mozart's ghost, just her. And it wasn't laughter anymore, it was recognition. Amara didn't walk faster or slower, her face didn't change, but inside something had shifted. The weight of invisibility had loosened, not gone, but different, seen. Near her locker, one boy who'd mimicked a violin screech on Wednesday glanced her way, then quickly looked down. Another girl who used to snicker when Amara walked past now stared at her shoelaces. Guilt didn't always apologize out loud. Sometimes it just shut up. At lunch, Jalen Davis slid a carton of chocolate milk across the table toward her without a word. She raised an eyebrow. He leaned in. "Next time we duet." Amara let the corner of her mouth rise just a little, not quite a smile, not yet. "You're not ready." His eyes lit up. It was the first time anyone had heard her tease. She took the milk anyway. Across the cafeteria, Coach Ellis stood by the wall talking to another teacher. He rubbed the back of his neck, watching Amara out of the corner of his eye. "Guess I still got things to learn," he muttered. The teacher beside him nodded. Later that afternoon, someone noticed a new flyer on the bulletin board outside the main office. Same title, same bright paper, but one line had changed. Roosevelt Talent Showcase, now featuring original student compositions, handwritten in red by Ms. Delgado. It wasn't a revolution, but it was something. The violin stayed closed that night. For the first time in weeks, maybe months, Amara Brooks didn't open the case, didn't retune, didn't practice until her fingertips numbed. She sat cross-legged on the floor in front of the old TV, a blanket draped over her shoulders, her little brother Zion pressed against her side. They watched cartoons with the volume off, the flickering colors painting both of their faces in shifting blues and oranges. He leaned his head on her arm. "No music tonight." She didn't look away from the screen. Don't need it. The room was warm, not from the radiator, it barely worked, but from something quieter, thicker, like breath held and finally let go. From the kitchen doorway, Latasha peeked in. She still had her work shoes on, one hand holding a chipped mug, the other resting on her hip. "You good?" she asked, voice low. Amara nodded. "Yeah, I'm good." And she meant it. Later, after Zion had fallen asleep mid-episode and Latasha had slipped off to bed, Amara stood in the doorway of the laundry nook. The violin case was still there, resting gently on the crate where she'd left it. She didn't open it. She just looked at it, not like a weapon, not like a shield, like a door. Something that could open again when she was ready, not to defend herself, but to introduce herself, to speak. Her fingertips still carried the ghost of the strings. Her muscles remembered the tension, the breath, the stillness between notes, and for once that was enough. Some voices whisper until the world's loud enough to hear them. Others play.